Using the complicated we know to deter the adverse effects of the complex we don't. Today's 10-minute short topic. I'm Joshua Barnes, and as always, I'm joined by Al Shalloway. So let me introduce a little bit on these 10-minute shorts that we've been doing. So these are intended to be a preview for a full 1-hour webinar through Al's Amplio Community of Practice that are completely free. All you got to do is sign up for the Community of Practice. And this will give you some insight into a bit of what the full webinar is going to be. Al, did you want to add anything on top of that?
Yeah, actually, about the Amplio Community of Practice, we do hold those weekly on Wednesday mornings at 8 Pacific, 8 in the morning. I'm actually thinking of making the presentation shorter and have doctors in sessions right after that. I'm going to actually poll the people and the member. I had planned on having a doctors in like a meetup once every 4 weeks, but I think people would appreciate every week to have, hey, ask your questions. How can understanding flow, lean theory, constraint help you? So I think it's going to will be a presentation on Wednesday on this, but it'll probably be more like a half an hour with a half an hour doctors in. And you forgot to introduce my kitty, Brianna. See, she thinks the world is simple. Just give her as much ahi tuna as she wants, which means fresh bowl out there every day. And the world is actually simple. So this complicated, complex thing is actually all in the eyes of the beholder, in some ways. That's her opinion anyway.
Well, and if I would have known that Brianna was going to be making an appearance today, I would have got my cat Serenity, and we could have just had two cats talking.
That's right.
So on this topic, so some of the biggest wastes result from nonlinear events, which is when a small event creates a significant outcome. And one of the ways I want to kind of lead into this discussion where Al's going to pick it up is if you think about, dominoes and a domino through what's called force amplification, it can knock over about 150% of its weight. So if you start stacking dominoes and each successive domino in a line is 150% of the weight in front of it, you can start with a teeny tiny one that's like 1 millimeter thick by 5 millimeters high. And in a chain of these increasing size dominoes, by the time you get to the 13th domino, the little bitty one you start by knocking over can knock over one that's 100 pounds. And if you were to extend it all the way out to 29 dominoes, that last one would be the size of the Empire State Building. So it's these tiny little events that can occur that can have some pretty big consequences.
Yeah, see, that's a great metaphor, because what we want to acknowledge is in the physical world, we have certain limitations on what we can do to adjust. But in the virtual world, we don't have those limitations. Not that it's easy necessarily, but we want to pay attention to them. What we want to do is stop this cascading effect as well. So what happens is you have this little event that, well, if you set it up to have all these dominoes knock it over, you knew that's what's going to happen. But let's look at three pretty well-known catastrophes. There's the Piper Alpha, rather. That was the oil platform in the North Sea that something went wrong. Something caught fire, and then it just cascaded and the whole thing blew up. A lot of people died. And what's interesting about that, it was a couple of small things that caused a cascade of errors. Some of those are also small things, but you had a big effect. Now, when that happened, there was nothing you could do because you couldn't change the location of a gas line. You couldn't see what was going on because it was physical. If you look at something like 3 Mile Island, a small event, a valve broke, but they didn't know what was going on. They didn't have visibility in what was going on. So what happened there is they made bad decisions, and those bad decisions led to other bad events. So you have this notion of a little thing happens where it gets coupled to bigger things. Like the little domino you tip over gets connected to others. I call that coupling, and nobody knows where to stop it because you can't see it. Whereas all you'd have to do in a domino case is pick up the domino so it breaks the chain. Right. And a third case I like to talk about is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. There's a bridge back this in the 40s built over the Tacoma Narrows that's like a big ravine with the water coming through. And it was when they didn't quite appreciate how wind can affect a bridge, and the thing started going. If you've never seen this movie, you've got to
It's
look.
very cool. Yeah.
Disaster on YouTube. The bridge, I'm talking a 2-lane road, concrete and steel, starts wobbling like this, eventually collapse. Now, this was a design flaw, but what's interesting is it wasn't just a pure design flaw. There was a very minor, I had to read all over the place to find this one. I'd read about Tacoma. I figured, oh, it was designed improperly and it just failed. But the answer is no. They had something in there to stop this from happening. They knew that this, or at least some of the people knew, it was a potential problem. The designer kind of scoffed at it. It's not going to be a big deal. I've got cable stays that'll stop it. A few of the cable stays popped off, and then that allowed it to vibrate, and bam, the bridge comes down. It's a little too late once the bridge starts going like this to put a couple of cable stays on, because it's already past the point where you can't correct it. So this is the issue. Our real problem is not complexity. Our real problem are these nonlinear events, and we have them in software. People tend to, you misunderstood something, a little misunderstanding. If you're a programmer, you're all too familiar. If you're an old-time programmer, you don't have this in Java so much now, or any of the newer languages, but in C, C++, you had what could be one-off events. You just were one off in the array, and you were going out somewhere that didn't exist. There are these tiny little things that could just cause serious problems. But the way you can stop these is by making everything visible and decoupling, which you couldn't do in the physical world. Like when 3 Mile Island, the valve, you couldn't go in there and see what was going on. So they had to infer what the water level was, and the way they had designed it didn't allow for it. So bad design and invisibility creates problems. In software, visibility you achieve called feedback at all levels, not just when it gets released, but at every level. The story, the feature, what we use minimum business increments, that would be a release. But throughout the process, you're getting feedback, you're getting visibility on what's going on. You decouple as best you can. That's where a pull mechanism is useful. And if you're driving to having a small amount of work in process at any one time, you redesign in a sense. You change directions, you pivot. See, people talk about, oh, we can pivot and we can do all this, but if it's going to cost you a lot to pivot, you aren't going to do it. It's going to be too expensive, so you're going to have to hope for things. So this is the point. In the software world, we have available to us tools to stop the 3 things that kill us in the physical world. Yes, small events might happen, but we can see them with visibility by feedback. We can decouple the events by using pull, so we know where people are available, and we can stop this cascading of errors. Complexity, I'm not saying complexity is not an issue, but complexity creates invisibility. The way I like to look at systems is a combination of Russ Akoff, who talks about systems are about the relationships between the components of the system, not the components themselves. So we have to recognize one thing affects something else, so we need feedback on how that works. This is where, when you have handoffs from like portfolio management to product management, you need to have it well defined, and you can validate you're doing that. And it's why, if you look at the value stream, you can see all the relationships, the main relationships. Everything affects everything else in a system, but the main things that affect each other are laid out in the value stream. So if you lay things out in the value stream, you get greater visibility, you can get agreement and collaboration, you can stop the cascading of errors, and you lower the cost by always focusing on being as complete as you can and avoiding overloading your capacity. So I don't worry about complexity, except I know these techniques will let me see what I need to do. And I recognize, final thing, there are different levels of complexity. In other words, look, who could have predicted COVID? Nobody. Actually, you could have predicted something was going to happen. That had been predicted. You couldn't predict it particularly. So the world throws these things at us. You can't really predict the market. Look, if you were making gas engines 20 years ago, what about electronic vehicles? So the market changes. And then there's how do I affect my product in the market? How do I get people to adopt new practices in my company? And how do I know what to do? I listed those in order of more complex to less complex. In other words, yes, there's complexity in the world. There's not much complexity, I'm sorry, about how we build. If you don't see cause and effect mostly, then you're not looking in the right place. And if you don't see it all, and you don't, then as you move forward and improve your models, you discover relationships you didn't see. So knowing how to work with cause and effect is not as difficult as a lot of people ascribe it to be. This is where their first principles, Factors for effective value stream, inherent simplicity from Ellie Goldratt in TOC. So my point is, don't avoid looking at things we should be able to see because we can't see everything, and recognize that we can see most of what's going on and how we work, and we can't see the whole world. But if we can be responsive, that gives us a competitive edge. I'm going to throw out one last thing. I'm not going to explain it so much, but it's the book Anti-Fragile. Anti-fragility is where you get stronger with things changing on you. Think of the people who could pivot when COVID happened. Think of what happened to like DoorDash. You know, think of what happened to delivery services. Those people came stronger, not weaker. That's where you want to be. And how do they do that? They work in small increments. They have feedback. They can pivot. They challenge their assumptions. You want to do that with what you do know, and you want to do that with what you don't know. And that's kind of the whole story compressed into 10 minutes exactly. I'm impressed, even with my cat distracting me here.
All right, Al. So for a deeper dive, we've got links that are in the chat to take you to the Amplio community of practice. Once again, thank you for joining us live, or if you're watching this on replay, post any comments that you have, and we'll see you on next week's 10-minute short. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.